I'm Bruce McCarthy, and I'm a product manager. Actually, I'm not a product manager anymore. I help product teams all around the world get better at product and at building their product culture. But honestly, I'm still a product manager at heart. It's cultural, right? There's a reason we're all here. It's partly about tools and tips and techniques. It's partly about how do you do a roadmap, like Jeff was telling us, and how do you manage to metrics and so on. But it's partly cultural too, isn't it? It's partly about us feeling like we all get it. We're kind of in the same club and part of the same culture. And it's a little bit different, I think, than what we think of as the old-fashioned command and control, plan everything out for a long time, focus on execution, divide up the work, and execute to the plan. That old-fashioned sort of execution, 20th century sort of culture. Maybe you know what I'm talking about, but if you don't, I want to tell you a little bit about my own personal journey of figuring out what was different between these two types of cultures and how I first sort of came to realize that this divide, this difference existed. I worked for my first software company a long time ago, and we were moving fast and kind of scrappy and growing fast and pretty successful, we thought, and we'd gotten to about 75 people, and I was in my first product management job, and I was really liking it. I had more than once been able to put together a plan and a proposal for launching a new product that had turned into multiple millions of dollars of growth for the company. And I thought, this is great. I know how this works. I've figured this out. I've got my operating system with my team and my peeps. And then we got acquired. We got acquired by a much bigger company, a much older company. We were about 4 or 5 years old at that point. This company had been around for 180 years. And they were not a tech company, they were not a software company, but they recognized that things were changing and they needed to get with the program and get into the modern age, and so they bought us. And for a while, that was okay. They left us alone, they let us do our thing, and I didn't really recognize much of a change, so I behaved the way I had behaved before. I came up with an idea. I researched it, I validated it, I put together a plan, I put together a proposal, and I sent it up the chain, which was a much bigger chain by that point. And I didn't hear anything. Nothing. Not, this is a stupid idea, this is a great idea, nothing at all. And I tried to get some response, and I got nowhere. And eventually, I just happened to be in a meeting with my boss's boss's boss. You can see where this is going. And I said, hey, what happened with that proposal that I sent? And she said, in these words, I will never forget them, she said, you have to understand, Bruce, we're just not trying to be entrepreneurial here. And I was silent for a long moment, and I was like, oh, okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know that, because I didn't know that, because I needed to hear that. I needed to understand that things were different in this organization, that the culture was different, and it was not going to be the way I thought it was going to be. That was a useful bit of information. So okay, going back to that slide. I left that job. I left that job within a few months, and I went and I worked for what I called a real software company again. And it was familiar, and it was comfortable, and it also challenged me and stretched me, and I learned a lot of new things, but I was in a company that wanted me to learn and wanted me to get where I was going. And so over time, I began to ask myself, what was different between these two worlds? Was it just entrepreneurialism, or was there more to it than that? What were the underlying cultural norms and principles, the ways of thinking, the habits of mind, the assumptions about why we were all here that were different between those organizations. And I ran, a couple of years ago, I ran across this from Netflix. Has anybody seen their culture deck on SlideShare? A few people here and there. It's worth checking out. They describe their internal culture, and they say it's not about the technology, it's not about the particular people who are employed here now. They say that because Gibb's not there anymore. It's not about our process, it's not about our tools, it's about our culture. It's that underlying, somewhat undefined thing here that gives us the best chance for success for multiple generations of tools and people and technology and process. And that resonated with me. And I started thinking about it, that not just any culture, but a product culture was the growth medium, the ideal conditions for sustained, over time, commercial success. And I said, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. And if I'm gonna say, okay, there's a cultural thing and it's a product-related culture, I need also to define what is a product. And I ran across, I was at a conference in Australia recently, and I met a terrific thought leader and speaker, Radhika Dutt. She's got a book coming out next year on radical product that I think you need to check out. And she has this terrific definition of what a product is. And a product, she says, is a vehicle for making change in the world. Now, maybe that sounds kind of high-minded and new agey and so on and aspirational, and that's true, and that's good by itself. But it's also actually really pragmatic and empowering if you think about it. Our products are ways that we give capabilities to our customers, that we change things for them and for the company as well. I wrote a whole book on tools and techniques for road mapping, and it actually, I would say, fairly agrees with a lot of what Jeff had to say earlier about outcome-based thinking. But I'm actually not going to talk about that today. I'm going to dig deeper into this cultural notion. I'm going to talk about what I think are the 4 principles of product culture, the 4 ways we operate as opposed to the tools and the techniques. And I think there are 4 of them, and the first one is actually to exhibit leadership in the area specifically of having a vision of human success and awesomeness. If we want to focus on the customer, if we want to focus on our teams, if we want to focus on our employees and the community, if we can create success and help them feel awesome, that is where it starts. That's the why we're in this in the first place. And I'm going to take a page out of Josh's book, and I'm going to trust that conflict can be good. And I'm going to take a stance opposite of what Alan said earlier, and I'm going to say the next principle is that we need to focus on outcomes and not on outputs. We need to focus on getting results for the customer and for the company, rather than focusing on, as Jeff was saying, all the features we're going to deliver in the roadmap. The third one is, if we're going to start with a vision of human success, if we're going to focus on getting to those outcomes rather than on specific features, then we don't necessarily know what's going to work when we start down this path, so we need to be willing to be wrong. We need to be willing to learn and experiment and improve continuously. And what I've also found, to complete the circle, or in this case the rectangle, here is the best way to accomplish these things is to build small, diverse teams, multiple different points of view, multiple different skill sets. When you can get a focused team with all these different points of view together, you can get into that learning loop, you can focus on outcomes, and you can get to radically better human success for your customer and for your people. So let me give you, this is good in theory, right? It sounds like motherhood and apple pie and agile and lean and all these great things. But let me give you some concrete examples. And I don't promise there won't be cars in here somewhere. Let's focus on the leading with human awesomeness. Now, I want to start by showing you a product. It's a cool product. Take a look at it. It's an MP3 player. It's got an armband with stripes on it. It's got a big chunky orange button, swoopy earbuds. It's nicely designed, and it has the creative name of, let me read it, SA5DOT, I can't even read the rest of it, /37. All right, so aside from the name, it's a cool product, or it's a cool looking product, right? But let me ask you, who is cool in this picture? Sure, there's an iPod here, and we're supposed to get it that the iPod is cool, but the real message is this guy is cool. The owner of the iPod is cool, and maybe we would associate that with him, and maybe we would conclude that he is cool, at least in part, because of the iPod. It's reversing the normal thinking about, is the product cool? No, the customer is cool. And if you think about it, I don't know if anybody's seen this slide before, but it's one of my favorite images on the entire internet. I found it on somebody's blog, on the useronboard.com blog. The customer is Mario. The product isn't actually the power-up, the flower that Mario eats. The product is Super Mario. The product is what happens when Mario gets the power-up. He becomes Super Mario, and that's what we're really selling. A smart person once told me, people don't buy your product, they buy a better version of themselves. And I think that's very true. I mean, that's taking selling on benefits to the logical conclusion and to the nth degree. And I think Jason Fried also is trying to say the same thing when he said, here's what our product can do versus here's what you can do with our product. They sound similar. The words are almost the same words, but the order of those words matters. Okay, so this sounds cool, and we're talking about big, successful companies like Apple. But an even more recent example, and maybe one that we all have a little bit of familiarity with, is the guys from Dropbox recently changed their company mission. They changed it to unleash the world's creative energy by designing a more enlightened way of working. So there you have the customer benefit built right into their mission. And they even then followed that up with a statement about how they're going to do that. They are going to transform the share folder that 90% of us probably have on our computers into a collaboration workspace. And when you hear that, that sounds like, oh, I'll bet a bunch of you are like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. I bet I could use that. It's fulfilling the promise of we're going to make you awesome. We're going to make you Super Mario. To me, that's focusing on making the customer awesome. So let me talk about the second principle. The second principle is outcomes over outputs. And maybe Alan was talking about business outcomes, which are important. But I think customer outcomes are at least as, and perhaps more important, and a valid way of thinking about this. Whether it's internal or external, though, I want us all to think about focusing on what's the result we're looking for, the outcome we're looking for. Should we do this or should we do that? Well, which one is more likely to get us to our outcome? And I'll use a story to explain that. Back in the early 80s, Porsche, see, he said it would come up. I can't help myself. Was actually not doing very well. They had officially decided to cancel their flagship car, the 911, because it wasn't selling well. And they had 3 straight years of sales declines, and they were facing the possibility of net losses for the first time since the war. And they hired a new CEO, German-born but American-raised, Peter Schutz. And he came in, and he said, all right, I got to figure out a way to boost morale and drive focus in the organization. And he thought racing would be exciting because they had a good and long racing heritage. So he got, on his first day, he got the whole racing team together after he arrived in Germany and said, okay, what's hot in racing? And they said, well, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the biggest race of the year is in the world, is in 6 weeks. And he's like, great, okay, what's our plan? And they said, well, we're looking at our shoes because we do have a couple of cars in the race, and they'll do well. They should, acquit themselves fairly. But there's really no chance that they can win because they're just street cars that we have modified to run for 24 hours straight. And he paused for a long moment and said, so long as I am in charge, we will never again enter a race without the goal of winning. Now, he didn't say, you have to win, but he said, I want you to set that as an objective. That is the reason we enter races, is to try to win. And then he said, I'm an American diesel engineer. I don't know anything about racing. You are the experts in racing. So this meeting is over. You're going to go and figure out yourselves how we get to that objective. I'm not going to tell you how, and come back and tell me your plan. And they left with giant grins on their faces, actually, because they said, okay, we have a mandate, we have a mission, we have an objective, and we have the control ourselves to figure out how. And they only had 6 weeks to do it, so they came up with a harebrained scheme. They took a chassis out of mothballs from 2 years ago that had done well, but the engine was out of date, so they took an experimental, lab-grown race engine out from the lab that had never been tested in the real world, and they put it in the chassis, and they had enough time to get 2 whole cars together, and they won. Number 1 and number 2 at Le Mans that year. And they won because they decided that was the goal, and they had all the control that they needed. They had an impossible mission, but they somehow succeeded. He did not say to them, okay, here's the plan, guys. He said, you give me the plan. But he did set the goal, and I thought that was the most important thing he did that day. Well, the first thing he did was he set the goal. The second most important thing he did was to then shut up. When I talk to teams, I ask them all the time, tell me about your objectives. But I often hear things like, we need to do a redesign. And I say, well, okay, but why do you need to do the redesign? And they say, our stuff doesn't look good on mobile, so we need to redesign in a responsive kind of format so that mobile customers can access it. And I ask them, okay, why are mobile customers important? And they say, we've been watching the statistics, and it's gone from single-digit numbers to like 50% of our customers now are accessing our stuff via mobile. Oh, okay, well, are those the most important customers, and is it affecting their experience? Yeah, we're having a huge churn problem. Oh, okay, so what you're really saying is you need to keep your customers longer and grow lifetime value. That's the outcome you're looking for, is to keep the customers. And you've decided that a redesign is the way to do that through a chain of several steps of logic. Is that actually the best way to drive lifetime value? What if it turned out it would be easier if you added some new features or that were highly requested, or if you changed your pricing plan, or if you came up with some other benefit? What if you should instead do a native app instead of doing a responsive design? We can now have a conversation understanding the real objective about options, about trade-offs, about which way if we go down this path or the other path is more likely to get us to that objective with less effort. The same goes for social. We really need to integrate with Twitter. Why do we need to do that? Well, we're hoping that when people use our app and they tweet out what they're doing in it, that their social network will see that and will be interested in our product. Oh, okay, so this is a growth play. You're trying to grow your market share by growing awareness. Yes, is Twitter integration the best way to do that? Maybe, or maybe there's some other options you could pursue. Customer requests, the same thing. Maybe that'll help with lock-in. revenue. We could probably do better than we want to make money as an objective, right? Are there types of revenue you can ask your stakeholders that are more important to the company at this stage of growth than other types of revenue? Is it about top-line revenue? Is it about margin? Is it about new customer logos? Is it about one market or another? Maybe it's about recurring revenue as opposed to new logos. Okay, if we're specific about that, again, we can have a conversation about what's the best way to arrive there. But frequently I find customer requests or other specific things that people want to jam into your roadmap are somebody's best guess as to the solution without them really articulating the problem or the result that they are looking for. So always be asking why. Scalability is one of my favorites. Engineering wants to focus on scalability, and that's what they think is product manager speak for we want to work on tech debt. But there's a legitimate case to be made for it. If you currently have 100 customers and your system is kind of creaking to serve those 100 customers, and you're planning on growing to 1,000 customers next year, you need to worry about scalability. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to do a whole platform rewrite necessarily. Maybe that's the only way, or maybe you can just buy more space on AWS. What's the fastest, bestest way to get to that outcome is the conversation you can then have. My favorite one on this list, though, was once my CEO said to me, "Bruce, what I really want is transformational ideas." And trying to hear through his accent was one thing, but trying to figure out what he meant was even harder. What he meant, it turned out, after we talked about it and after we kind of worked through the problem, was that he thought that it would be possible to take some of our technology and our IP and apply it in other industries and be disruptive in those industries, but he knew that it was probably going to take some time, that if we spent that effort this year, it would probably not pay off in terms of real money this year. It would be multiple years down the road. So it would be leveraging the existing assets in a new area. So if I can sum up this difference between outcomes and outputs, it's in this chart here. A bad objective in my mind is we got to ship the thing. A better objective would be we got to ship the thing in order to get a result that we're looking for. And that result could be a business result and or a customer result. Ideally, I would rather have you focus on just, darn, now I have to go through all the clicking again. It's lagging a little bit on this monitor. Ideally, it would be just the increase the number. And now we can have a discussion about the best way to increase the number. And also we can run experiments. Wouldn't it be great if we could put on the roadmap, we're going to increase this number, and we'll figure out which way, rather than committing too early, is the best way to get to that number by trying a few things, by running a bunch of A/B tests, by doing some prototyping and putting it in front of customers. Then when we publish our roadmap, we haven't lied or changed our mind. All of this is about providing product teams, I think, with context rather than control. That's what Peter Schutz did when he started at Porsche and said, we should try to win. He didn't try to control them about how or when. He just said we should try. So, all right, if we're going to take this approach, if we're going to focus on customer success and awesomeness, if we're going to focus on the outcome for them and for the company, we need to do a lot of experimentation. And I'll use another Porsche example. Porsche went on from that win to win 7 years in a row at Le Mans, which is the longest unbroken streak of winning at Le Mans of any manufacturer, even Ferrari. And Porsche today, still, decades later, is the winningest manufacturer at Le Mans ever. And they began to get a reputation, as you can imagine, and folks in other manufacturing companies started noticing and partnered with them. So McLaren, famous for its gorgeous high-end sports cars, decided to partner with them. They said, we'll build the chassis and the body, and you, Porsche, you build the engines. Great. So they combined forces. They put a car into the race 1 year in the first year, and the first race was not going well. They were about halfway into the race, and the car began to overheat. Apparently, there wasn't enough air inside. There wasn't enough air coming in to cool the engine. So what did the Porsche engineer do? He said, okay, we will cut a hole right here, and we will rig up a chute with some cardboard and some duct tape, and we'll get the air into the engine compartment, and we'll cool off the engine. And what do you think the McLaren guy said? He said, I do not think you understand how perfect our design is. You will, over our dead body, touch the body of this car. And they didn't cut the hole, and that was pretty much the end of the partnership because the car had to limp across the finish line in last place. There's a difference in mindset there between the two companies, between the we will test it and figure it out versus our design is perfect. And it's your engine that's at fault, or it's the customer that's at fault, or it's the market that's at fault. I think that's an important distinction in culture. And I think that's also brought to mind actually by a quote from the son of the founder. Ferry Porsche was asked, because Porsches have become so valuable over time, what's his favorite model of Porsche ever? And instead of picking some obscure, very gorgeous 911 model, he said, we haven't built it yet. He said, the best Porsche is in the future. And I thought that was terrific. To me, the summary of that is, don't be thinking about competing with the competition to be better than some other artificial standard. Compete with yourself to make the customer successful. Compete with your own past and your own standards. Constantly be upping the game, and that's where really making the customer awesome and successful, and that's where a sustainable advantage comes from, is being the one that everybody says, man, these guys are just synonymous with sports cars. They are constantly working on their game. Now, I know this guy takes a little bit of grief these days, but they have put a lot of thought and a lot of science into doing this in the tech world, into this kind of continuous experimentation. Pretty much any engineer at Facebook, within certain constraints, can come up with a change to the experience and can release it live to the site under constraints. These are called feature flags. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. But there's this tool that I only learned about a couple of years ago called Gatekeeper that allows them to tightly and precisely control exactly when they, exactly and to whom they release those features. I have another a company that I work with that calls this the Andorra test, because Andorra is 1% of their traffic. And so they figure they can try crazy experiments there and not worry about it. What that means is that, learning, continuous learning, is actually greater than success on any one venture, any one feature. Tying that together, that learning and improving is necessary to focus on outcomes, is necessary to get to those successes for the customer. And my last point about product culture is about building the right team. And I think of the team as like the pit crew for a racing team. If you think about the race car, it's got to run for a long time on the track. It's going to have to come in for maintenance, but the team never knows exactly what's going to be wrong. Yeah, there is a tire person. There is a transmission person. There's a fuel person. There's somebody who makes sure that the driver is hydrated. But they don't know when the car comes in off the track which of these things might be needed. And so they drop the roles and they pull together all of their skills and they do quick assessment of what's needed with this car, and they focus on the outcome of getting it back on the track, ready to go as quickly as possible. That kind of cross-functional and yet team-first sort of orientation is important. And there's another aspect to team that I think is really important, and that is size. There's this company in the US called Flow that does a project management tool, and they plotted how many things their customers get done in a month versus the size of the teams actually doing the things that are tracked in their tool. And they discovered an interesting fact that 7 plus or minus 2 rule that we all learned about agile, it's actually more like 5 plus or minus 2. 7 is about as big as you want to get. In fact, if you look at the graph, by the time you add a 7th person, you've added absolutely no additional productivity to your team. Not on a per-person basis, but entirely for the team. You might as well split the team at that point into 3 and 4. You'll get more out of them. And that is the science that sort of proves the Amazon 2-pizza rule, right? So, okay, this whole system is self-reinforcing. It starts with the customer. It focuses on outcomes. It learns in order to get to the outcomes. It builds, and it's necessary to build small teams in order to make this happen. It's not about the products. It's not about the solutions. It's about the system, the culture that is able to figure out the situation well enough to pull the right solutions together in the right time. That's the growth medium that we're looking for. I'll tell one more really quick story because I'm out of time. I worked with this company, Vistaprint. Has anybody heard of Vistaprint, the business card people in the US? And they were set up for a long time in silos, functional silos. They were highly productive in terms of lines of code written and utilization of their people. But the product team had struggled for 2 years to improve the search experience for the products on their website, on their e-commerce website. They had been stuck in design reviews and architecture and resource allocation and budgeting and all of this stuff for 2 years and had made no progress whatsoever. We sat down and we worked out a new way of working. They put together a full stack team, product, back end, front end, everything necessary, UX, research. They figured it out, how to work together as a team, and in 6 weeks, they got it done. They fixed the search algorithm, and how did they know that they got it done? They had a metric to tell them that people bounced less off of the results page, far less than they had before. And the difference was not the technology, not the tools, not the people. They didn't hire a single additional person. It was all in how they thought about the problem. If this has been useful, if this summary makes sense to you, then feel free to sign up for my Nano letter. It's a very short newsletter meant to be read on your phone without a lot of scrolling while you're waiting for coffee. It's called One Thing on Product Culture, and you can subscribe at productculture.org. Thanks a lot for listening.